In addition to knowing whether Bitcoin is worth buying and holding, the kinds of questions that brought you to it, Jake, here's a big ethical question we might want to know, which is whether Bitcoin's actually good for the world. And an ethical investor will want to know this, just as an ethical investor will want to know, is investing in a tobacco company going to make my world worse or not? You might want to know something about the product and its effects on people when making that decision. And that's not ethics divorced from investment there, because if it's bad for the world and bad for people, that might inform your investment thesis. For example, that people will wean their reliance on cigarettes and move to something else instead. So one thing we wanted to do was help people think about that. Is Bitcoin actually good for the world? And that's a different question than, is Bitcoin good for me? So what we wanted is to find a thought experiment or some sort of principle that would help us separate our own goods, our own concerns, from those that are relevant to assessing Bitcoin for the world. What we came up with is this. It's a thought experiment. Imagine that you fall asleep and that when you wake up, you will be someone, but you don't know who that person will be. Could be Michael Saylor, CEO of Strategy. Could be Jake Woodhouse, an Englishman who lives in Melbourne, is it? Could be a philosophy professor in Singapore.
Yes, in Australia, yeah.
It could be a Venezuelan farmer. It could be a dissident journalist in Russia. You don't know. Now imagine that you could choose whether Bitcoin will exist in the world or not after you wake up, and you, again, don't know who you'd be. What this helps us do is think about the people for whom Bitcoin is good and think about it in this abstracted, worldly sense rather than only from our own perspectives. And one striking feature about Bitcoin is that it helps people on certain margins, people like dissident journalists or criminals of certain kinds, or people interested in funding terrorism, or people who are resisting authoritarian regimes, margins of many kinds, good and bad. Bitcoin is a useful tool for them. And if you have a chance of being one of those people, we argue that you would want there to be Bitcoin in the world, to be there for you as a useful tool, as an option, and as a means of resistance for the authorities that would try to get between you and your money, the authorities that would try to block transactions, to surveil or control on the basis of political ideology, or to debase the only currency available to you, as happens to something like 2 billion people alive today, suffering under double-digit inflation every year. So for those people, even if you aren't in fact one of those people, you could have been, or you have a 1 in 4 chance of being such a person. And once you see that, then we think that you can see that, yes, Bitcoin is good for the world. Even if you're one of these people who says, I don't know, I have access to the Aussie dollar, I have access to the Singapore dollar, I don't need Bitcoin. That's not the question. The question isn't whether you need Bitcoin or whether it's good for you. It's whether it's good for the world. We found it helpful to see that extra good that Bitcoin does for the world beyond just what it does for me, some normie academic in Singapore who has access to a pretty good fiat money system as far as those things go.
Bitcoin with Jake was a podcast I created from 2022 to 2023, and I interviewed about 80 people all across the world. And the countries in which people sat where financial services were poorest had the most compelling buy Bitcoin stories. And so it was clear to me that, to take a kind of startup analogy, product market fit was on the financial fringes. And that remains true from an individual perspective, from a nation state perspective, and from basically any organization. The case for Bitcoin to receive value, to send value, to store value with no ID requirements, just an internet connection, it's an absolute game changer. And that was something that I found very interesting, because it hammered home that this wasn't just like some speculative thing. It was like, no, it's actually providing value for people today in massive quantities. And you can have someone say, oh, it's just a Ponzi. But once you start digging underneath and looking at the finer details, it's just so clearly not the case. And I like that word abstract, because I think a lot of us haven't slowed down and asked what is a philosophical question. What is money? And perhaps you could argue that money is an abstraction of our time and energy. And I've seen people talk about this a lot, but your students come to you, they've got all these different questions. And I assume when you're sitting in a position like that, the instinct to teach is very, very strong. And it's like, okay, how can I teach these kids to live a healthier and happier life? But like, how do you know you're teaching them the right thing? And just reflect on, if you may, the process of learning about Bitcoin when you're in that position. How did you first start looking into it? And why was it clear that that needed to be included in your class about money?
Your first question is a deep and important one for any teacher to grapple with, because teaching is an important responsibility, especially if you conceive of teaching as imparting something to someone else, because then you need to be damn well sure that what you're imparting is correct and good and true and beautiful. And if it isn't, you're leading young people astray. Actually, think of teaching as slightly different than imparting. And one of the main tools I use as a teacher is not telling somebody something, it's asking them something. And this is this is going to sound corny. It goes all the way back to Socrates. What did he do on the streets of Athens? He asked questions. And of course, his questions were annoying ones that drove people batty, and they killed him for it. But philosophers tend to take him as a kind of patron saint for a good reason. A question is a powerful tool. You alluded to one question. What is money? Of course, there are many good questions. So I see one of my jobs as a teacher is just to find the question that a student needs in her place, in his time, given their own concerns in life, and ask them in a way that gets them to see its importance and the difficulty in actually answering it. And once you see those two things, that a question's important and that it's hard to answer, it'll drive you mad. It'll drive you to learn, that is. It'll drive you to be curious.
Yeah,
to
I've got to
investigate.
figure this out. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what I see as my job in the classroom, is often not to say things, it's to ask them and make students say things and grow themselves the capacities to find the answers they need.